Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to our vegetable garden in Spokane, Washington, where the hardiness zone ranges from 5B to 6A. Well, it's been a couple of weeks since you've seen me because Bill and I just got back from a wonderful 2-week trip to Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. We had a delightful time, and I have to admit, while we were gone, I kept thinking, oh, are we going to get frost? What's going to happen with the garden? You know, we had tried to harvest as much as we could before we left. It's very hard going on a trip during the growing season, right? So we did get a couple of frosts, and what I wanted to show you today is the status of the garden, what needs to come out right now, which plants are finished, and I also want to give you a peek at the fall garden that I planted because it is doing awesome. Now there's two things that I forgot to mention. One is I have a serious case of jet lag. We got in at midnight last night. It took 3 flights to get back to Spokane from Nova Scotia. And so if I sound a little loopy today, I hope you will take that into account. The other thing is we have a windstorm that is just starting to arrive here. I'm hoping the sound quality will be fine, and I'm hoping I can get this done before we get the really high winds. So let's see how we do. Now here are some zucchini plants that I planted later because the other ones were struggling so badly. It's just been one of those weird seasons where we've had some oddball problems. The interesting thing is you can see this is what was hit by the frost, and there's still some green leaves. There's even a couple of little baby zucchinis in there. So I'm just going to leave the plants in place. I did harvest a big one from this plant this morning because I can use it to make zucchini bread or something like that. I hate to have anything go to waste. Here's the Swiss chard and beet bed, and everything is just fine. Swiss chard and beets are quite cold tolerant, so they were not impacted by the frost in the least. I will definitely harvest some more leaves off the plants, but I'll leave the main part of each plant in place so that they can continue to produce leaves for as long as possible. So here's the broccoli bed. Broccoli is also, as a member of the cabbage family, quite tolerant of cold. So it did all right. But when we were leaving, I was so frustrated because there were a lot of tiny little heads. And I thought, well, I'm just going to let them develop into big heads while we're gone. Well, many of them are past their prime. I think I can still use a lot of them, so I'll harvest them. I still have some smaller heads on here, and I'm going to let them grow. But now that we're home, I'll be able to keep a close eye on them. This is the bed that I planted some buckwheat seeds in as a cover crop. And first of all, I don't know if you can see it, but look at all of the bees on it. They just love those flowers. So those plants developed like crazy while we were gone because they were very short, just had some leaves, and now of course they're covered with flowers. What I'm going to do is chop them down and just let them decompose naturally on the soil surface. That will in turn send nutrients into the soil, and that will be great for whatever gets grown in this bed next year. Well, look what I just discovered. The floating row cover blew off of the root crop bed that is part of our fall garden. And I can see all kinds of bird damage in there, so I'm blaming our resident California quail. There's probably also some insect damage on some of the leaves, just looking at the types of damage. So here's what I mean by the bird damage. You can see that the leafier part of the foliage has been picked clean and they've just left the center stems. That is frustrating. But I think if I go ahead and cover this bed back up, it should be all right. Now let me show you what I think is insect damage. Now this is a row of silky sweet turnips, and they are members of the cabbage family. So I would tend to suspect cabbage worms of some sort. However, slugs certainly like cabbage family plants as well. Could be either. I'm going to go ahead and check all the leaves in the row to see what's going on. If I see any caterpillars, you better believe I'm going to squish them. But then the final thing I need to do is to get this bed recovered and really batten down the hatches because of the windstorm that's starting to develop here. Well, you've seen the pole bean arbor many a time during the summer, and you can see it definitely got frosted. There's a few beans left on it that I probably can salvage, so I'll make sure I pull those. But the plants were basically done producing before we even left town, so I didn't feel so badly about that. But I'll go ahead and harvest that, and then when Bill and I start cleaning up the garden, what we're going to do is we'll pull the vines off of the arbor, and we have a chipper shredder that we use to grind things up and put into our compost pile for the winter. But if you don't have one, you can use hedge shears and just kind of chop them up a little bit, because the more you chop them, the more it opens up surfaces for microorganisms to break them down. So you want to have a lot of surface area. And if you don't have a hedge shears, you could go ahead and just mow over the vines and put them into your compost pile. Let's talk tomatoes. Now I have to admit, before we left on our trip, this was the crop I was the most concerned about, because yes, they frost very easily, and you might recall that these plants were so far behind in their development. That's because we had a cold spring and lots of crazy temperature extremes into the summer. So these plants were really struggling. I did get a nice harvest of red tomatoes well before we left. And then I harvested a lot of green ones because I was so worried I was going to come back to black plants. Well, I'll show you this up close, but you can see they did get frosted, but there's a silver lining. Most of this bed has Supremo paste tomatoes in it, and you can see by the foliage it definitely got burned by frost. And I was checking the tomatoes, and they are in very nice shape. Look at that. So fortunately, the tomatoes seem to fare okay, and I get to harvest a bunch of them. I grew these last year for the first time, and I was so impressed with them. So they make a great sauce. At the end of the same bed, I also had one plant that is Chef's Choice Orange. That is my favorite slicing tomato. And look at that gorgeous color. So these are in great shape. I'm going to pick them as well. And mostly we use them to make sandwiches. So I'm looking forward to that. In this other bed, I'm growing Blue Beach paste tomatoes. If you haven't seen my videos before, it is a variety that is great for making sauces and salsa and so on. It was recommended to me by a friend because they are more resistant to developing blossom end rot, which is a great attribute. So when I came out to the garden this morning, I saw some of them on the ground, and I thought, oh boy, they've probably been nibbled on by something. They're probably all rotten. Well, no, they're absolutely perfect, so they are going into the harvest basket as well. So this is our orchard rack. I bought it from Gardener's Supply quite a few years ago. You can see it still looks like brand new, even though I use it every single year. The tomatoes are lying on sheets of newspaper, and it's quite dark down here in our basement. But this was a way for me to salvage the tomato crop, which is what I thought I was going to have to do because I was so worried that everything would get frosted while we were out of town. You'll recall that Bill is the pepper grower in the family, and he's growing quite a range of both sweet and hot peppers inside our little hoop house. Because of that, they were protected from the frosts. And peppers are very susceptible to frost, so we have not lost any. And we're planning to make a huge batch of salsa tomorrow, so that's where a lot of these peppers are going to end up. So this is my winter squash arbor, and as you can see, they definitely got frosted. Fortunately, just the foliage. And I knew that the squash would be okay unless we had a super hard frost, which we didn't, thankfully. So I'm going to show you what to look for harvesting your winter squash, and then talk about the all-important step of curing them for 2 weeks before you put them into storage. Now all of these tan colored ones are autumn frost winter squash. I've been growing them for several years now and I love them. They're so good roasted. So let me just cut this leaf out of the way here so we can see what we're doing. So first thing I want to do to know if they're ready to be picked is the thumbnail test, and that's where I push my thumbnail into the skin. If it cuts through easily, it's not ripe. If it doesn't, that tells me it's ripe. And then I also want to look at the stem. And since it's a little hard for you to see, I'm going to go ahead and clip this one because it meets my criteria. See how this is gold rather than a bright green stem? That's a very good sign that it's ripe. When I harvest winter squash and also pumpkins, I always leave a few inches of stem attached to the squash or pumpkin. Because if I cut it off right at the base or I knock it off, that opens up this area to rotting, and I want these to keep for a long time in storage, which they normally do. So I'm going to go ahead and harvest all of the ripe ones because I've been looking at them and checking on them, and then let's talk about curing. So let's talk about curing. Now I did mention it in a previous video, but I wanted to include it in today's video since I'm doing a lot of harvesting, especially of the winter squash. And this applies to both winter squash and pumpkins. So after you have harvested them, you need to move them for 2 weeks to an area that is bright, warm, and protected from the elements, so the weather. I happen to have an empty greenhouse, and so it's a perfect place because it meets all of those criteria. And what happens is that the skin hardens off, and these will keep in storage for far longer than you thought possible. Not everybody has a greenhouse, I get that. Maybe you have a sunny porch. Maybe you have a sunroom. Maybe you have a carport that you might be able to use for that. But this process is so worth it because you will be eating and enjoying these squash for so long. Now, speaking of pumpkins, this is my 2024 pumpkin harvest. Pretty pathetic, right? So we were having a ton of problems with the plants that we grew in these southernmost beds. And that's because there's more shade, there's potential roots that are coming from the trees, taking some of the moisture out of the soil. So I will not plant things like this in these beds next year and from that point on. Frustrating. But anyway, I have these harvested. I'm going to go ahead and add them to the winter squash in the greenhouse. Let's talk about root crops for a moment. You're looking at the bed where I've been growing carrots and parsnips. The great thing about root crops is that they can withstand frosts. As a matter of fact, the frosts actually make their roots taste sweeter, so that's a side benefit. But the important thing you need to remember is you have got to harvest them before your ground freezes solid, because there's no way you're going to get them out of there, and the roots aren't going to be in any shape for being eaten anyway. So other examples of root crops in addition to the carrots and parsnips would be things like beets, radishes, turnips, and even leeks. So because the carrots and parsnips can withstand the frost and the roots are going to get sweeter, I'm not in a huge hurry to harvest them. I'll probably dig them up in about 2 weeks. Well, the wind is really picking up and it's starting to rain, so I need to wrap this up. But I did promise you a look at the other part of my fall garden, which is in the bed you're looking at right now. So in this end of the bed is where I have the Cascadia sugar snap peas growing. And you'll recall I mentioned how the seed packet said that the plants would not require support. Ha! That was wrong. I tried it. They fell all over the place, so I put in some stakes, and as you can see, they're growing beautifully because they're holding on to the stakes. So never believe that information on a pea packet. Anyway, you can see that they're blooming like crazy. Are they going to have enough time to develop the pods? We'll just have to wait and see. But did you know that the foliage of pea plants tastes just like the pea pods? So I'm going to put some of this in a salad with dinner tonight. Okay, you'd laugh if you saw me right now because I'm underneath the agricultural insect netting so I can show you what's growing in here. But we are using the netting to keep the California quail away, also the wild cottontail that is around here, as well as any types of insects that might bother both the spinach and the pak choi. So that's why it's covered. Anyway, all of these things are cold tolerant. If you look in the left row, you see kind of a frilly leaf. Those are Bauer lettuce. It's a leaf lettuce that I'm crazy about. It's fabulous in salads. There will be some in tonight's salad. And I've grown it for a few years and I'm very happy with it. Now, the second row from the left is the giant winter spinach that I'm growing for the first time. Look at the size of those leaves. Holy cow. The next row over to the right is some endive, and it is taking its time getting going, but it's quite cold tolerant, so it should be all right. And then those frilly looking things on the right hand side are pak choi. And we have grown those for a few years, and they are fabulous in stir fries, so I definitely recommend them. But I would say that this part of my fall garden is doing very well. Okay, it's time for me to get out of this weather. I hope you found this video helpful. I also hope that you haven't had a frost yet, but if you have, now you know what to do with your different crops. So, as I was sitting here, I just noticed some tiny little pea pods on the peas, so that's encouraging. Thanks so much for watching today, everybody. Happy gardening.